Welcome, the Haunted Tales brave souls, to a journey through the shadows of Pennsylvania, a land rich in history, and haunted by its past. From eerie asylums where tortured spirits still roam, to battlefields echoing with the cries of fallen soldiers, Pennsylvania is home to some of the most terrifying hauntings in America. Tonight, we'll venture into the depths of the unknown, uncovering the ghostly tales behind 5 of the state's most haunted locations. But be warned, some say that merely hearing these stories invites the spirits to follow. Are you ready? Then let's begin. Whispers in the rotting stone. James Carter wasn't afraid of ghosts. He had built his reputation as a paranormal investigator by debunking hauntings, exposing hoaxes, and laughing in the face of so-called supernatural activity. So, when he arrived at Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, camera in hand, he expected nothing more than cold drafts and creaking iron doors. The penitentiary loomed over him, its Gothic stone walls crumbling under centuries of decay. Shadows pooled in the arched doorways, and the towers seemed to leer at him as he entered. James adjusted his headlamp and switched on his camera. The red recording light flickered to life. "All right, folks," he said, his voice echoing down the empty cell block. "Welcome to Eastern State Penitentiary, one of the most haunted places in America. Let's see what's really lurking in the dark." The tour guides had long since left for the night, leaving him utterly alone. The silence pressed against him, heavy and unnatural. He walked deeper into the penitentiary, past rows of decayed cells, their iron bars rusted and doors hanging ajar. The scent of damp stone and mildew filled his nostrils. The stories about Eastern State were endless: shadow figures in the corridors, ghostly whispers in cell block 12, a warden who still roamed the halls long after his death. But James didn't believe in any of it. Then, he heard a whisper. Faint, almost indistinct, but definitely there. James froze, his breath catching. He replayed the audio on his camera, adjusting the volume. The whisper was still there, a murmur, something just beyond the edge of comprehension. He exhaled sharply. "All right, let's check it out." Following the sound, he stepped into cell block 12. The air was heavier here, thick with something James couldn't quite define. His footsteps echoed loudly, but beneath them, he swore he could hear something else, bare feet slapping against the cold stone. His light flickered. James smacked the flashlight, and it steadied, illuminating the peeling walls and rusted fixtures. The cell doors stood open, revealing narrow chambers, their stone bunks still bolted to the walls. He moved deeper in, panning the camera across the decayed remains of the prison. Then, the whisper came again. Closer. James swung his camera toward the sound. His light landed on a cell at the end of the corridor, its interior shrouded in darkness. Something shifted inside. A shadow, darker than the cell itself, moved. James swallowed hard. "All right, if there's anyone here, make yourself known." Silence. He took a cautious step forward, peering into the cell. A figure stood inside. James recoiled, his heart pounding. The figure was barely visible, a black silhouette, its features obscured by the thick, unnatural darkness. Then, it lunged. James staggered back, his camera shaking. The cell doors slammed shut with a deafening clang, dust exploding into the air. His breath came in ragged gasps as he turned and sprinted down the corridor. The whispers followed him. They grew louder, overlapping, dozens of voices murmuring in his ears. Some were pleading. Others were laughing. He stumbled into a large central room, the surveillance hub where guards once watched over the prisoners. His hands fumbled for his phone, but the screen remained black. No signal. No light. The whispers stopped. Then, something spoke, not a whisper. Not a murmur. A voice. Deep. Hollow. "You shouldn't have come." James whipped around. The warden's office. He stepped inside. A heavy wooden desk, covered in dust, stood in the center. The chair was turned away, facing the cracked window. His camera still rolling, James lifted it toward the chair. A long pause. Then, the chair creaked. It turned, slowly, painfully, until it faced him. James's breath hitched. A man sat there. His face was pale, almost skeletal, his eyes hollow pits of darkness. He wore a black suit, a warden's badge pinned to his chest. The air in the room thickened, pressing against James's lungs. "Who are you?" he managed. The figure tilted its head. Then, in a voice that rattled the walls, it whispered, "I never left." James felt something tighten around his throat. An unseen force lifted him off the ground, choking the breath from his lungs. His camera fell, clattering to the floor, its lens capturing the floating form of a man in a warden's uniform. His grin wide, his teeth black with decay. The shadows twisted, coiling around James like fingers. He kicked and struggled, his vision blurring. Then, he was falling. The force released him, and he crashed onto the cold stone floor, gasping for air. His camera lay a few feet away, still recording. The chair was empty. The office silent. James scrambled to his feet, grabbed his camera, and ran. He didn't stop until he burst through the entrance, collapsing onto the cracked pavement outside. The prison loomed behind him, silent once more. His camera flickered. James stared at the screen, his hands shaking. The last few seconds of footage played back, the empty chair. Then, just before the clip ended, the warden's voice, clear as day. The shadows of Gettysburg. Ethan Foster had always been fascinated by history, particularly the Civil War. When he got the chance to visit Gettysburg battlefield on a late autumn evening, he couldn't resist. The air was crisp, the leaves a dying shade of orange, and the whispers of the past seemed to dance through the wind. The park was nearly empty by the time he arrived. A few tourists lingered, but as the sun began its slow descent, they trickled out one by one. Ethan, however, wanted to experience the battlefield at dusk, the time when legends said the spirits were most active. He adjusted his camera, checking the settings. He had read about ghostly apparitions, disembodied voices, and shadowy figures lurking among the monuments. His goal was simple: capture something, anything. As he walked along the worn paths, he reached Devil's Den, a notorious rock formation where countless soldiers had fallen. A deep stillness settled over the landscape. The trees stood like silent sentinels, their branches swaying gently as if whispering secrets from long ago. Ethan knelt to adjust his lens when a sharp snap of a twig made him freeze. His heart pounded as he turned. Nothing. A breath of wind, low and cold, brushed against his neck. Then, a whisper. "Help me!" Ethan's blood ran cold. The voice was barely audible, but it was there, distinct, pleading. He swung his camera toward the source. The setting sun cast long shadows over the rocks, but amidst them, he saw movement. A figure. Dressed in a tattered Confederate uniform, the man stood at the edge of the boulders, one hand clutching his side as though wounded. His eyes, dark and sunken, locked onto Ethan's. Ethan's first instinct was to help, but something was wrong. The figure didn't move like a living man. His chest did not rise and fall with breath, and his feet seemed to hover slightly above the ground. Ethan swallowed hard, stepping back. The ghost took a staggering step forward, lips parting in a silent plea. Then, he vanished. A sharp gust of wind rustled the trees, and Ethan shuddered. He had seen ghosts before, at least he thought he had. But this was different. More real. More aware. He pressed forward, determined to capture more footage. He made his way to Little Round Top, another infamous site where Union soldiers had fought desperately to hold the high ground. The moment he stepped onto the hill, the atmosphere shifted. The air became thick, heavy with something unseen. He set up his tripod and began filming. The wind whispered through the grass, but beneath it, he heard another sound, marching. It started faintly, like distant thunder. But it grew louder, boom, boom, the sound of cannons. A cold sweat broke out on Ethan's forehead. He turned, scanning the battlefield. It was empty, yet the echoes of war surrounded him. Then came the shouts. "Hold the line! Fire! Charge!" The ghostly battle erupted around him. Figures flickered into existence, soldiers in tattered uniforms, their faces twisted in agony, muskets clutched in their hands. They ran past Ethan as though he wasn't there, their forms half translucent yet horrifyingly real. A cannon blast exploded nearby, knocking Ethan backward. He scrambled to his feet, breath ragged, gripping his camera like a lifeline. The battle raged on, but then he saw him. A lone Union soldier stood just feet away. His blue coat was stained with blood, his face gaunt and pale. He wasn't like the others. He was looking directly at Ethan. "You shouldn't be here." The soldier's voice was hollow, echoing with centuries of sorrow. Ethan backed away, but the soldier followed. "You must leave, before the darkness finds you." Darkness? Ethan's pulse thundered in his ears. The battlefield around him started to shift. The trees twisted into gnarled shapes, the ground darkened with something black and inky. The spirits of soldiers screamed as shadowy tendrils rose from the earth, wrapping around their flickering forms, dragging them down into the abyss. Ethan turned and ran. His feet pounded against the ground as the battlefield seemed to stretch endlessly before him. The air grew suffocating, heavy with the stench of death. The whispers became screams, filling his ears, his mind, then silence. Ethan stumbled to a stop, gasping for breath. He had made it back to the visitor center parking lot. The battlefield behind him was still again, bathed in the dying light of sunset. His hands shook as he checked his camera. The footage was corrupted, static, warping shadows, faint voices. But one frame was clear, the face of the Union soldier, and behind him, in the creeping darkness, something else. Something ancient, something still watching. The Seven Gates of Hell, York County, Pennsylvania, has always been home to unsettling legends, but none as chilling as the tale of the Seven Gates of Hell. They say that passing through all seven gates will open a path to the underworld itself. While many dismiss the story as folklore, others whisper of those who tried and never returned. For years, James Langley had been obsessed with the legend. A journalist specializing in the supernatural, he had written articles on haunted asylums, ghost ships, and ancient curses, but nothing had ever felt quite real. That changed when he stumbled upon a forgotten letter in an old library archive. The letter, dated 1897, was written by a man named Elias Rutherford. Elias claimed to have found the first gate deep in the woods outside Hellam Township. His words trembled on the page. "I have crossed the first gate. The air is thick, the silence unnatural. Something watches me from the trees." But that was all. No further letters were found. James couldn't resist. He packed his bag, bringing along a flashlight, a notebook, and a digital recorder. His friend Daniel, a skeptical but loyal companion, agreed to join him. The two set off just after sunset, following the map James had pieced together from old texts and local rumors. The first gate was easy to find, a rusted iron arch standing in the middle of a narrow path. As James and Daniel stepped through, the forest fell into an eerie stillness. Crickets ceased their song, and the wind stilled. "Creepy," Daniel muttered. "But hardly hellish." They pressed on. The second and third gates were deeper in the woods, hidden beneath twisted vines and gnarled branches. James noted how the air seemed heavier with each step, as if the forest itself resisted their progress. By the time they passed the fourth gate, the world around them had changed. The trees, once vibrant and full, were now skeletal husks. A thick fog coiled through the trunks, and the distant hoot of an owl was the only sound that remained. "I don't like this," Daniel admitted. "It's like we're not alone anymore." James nodded but pressed forward. The fifth gate was different. It wasn't just an archway but a crumbling stone frame, covered in strange symbols. James traced a finger over the carvings, feeling a sudden jolt of cold shoot through his bones. "James, something's moving." Daniel's voice was barely above a whisper. James turned, his flashlight sweeping through the fog. Shadows twisted unnaturally between the trees. Then, a sound, low, guttural breathing. "Run!" They sprinted through the trees, crashing through the undergrowth until they saw the sixth gate ahead, a towering wooden door in the middle of a clearing. James hesitated, but Daniel shoved him forward. "We have to get out of here!" They burst through, and suddenly, the forest was silent again. The air was thin, dry. James gasped, doubling over. They were somewhere else now, a place untouched by time. A cracked stone path led to the final gate, a monstrous iron construct, its metal blackened and pulsing like it was alive. Beyond it lay only darkness, a void that swallowed the light from their flashlights. Then came the whispers. They curled around them like tendrils, voices overlapping, sobbing, laughing, pleading. James clutched his head, trying to drown them out, but they only grew louder. Daniel! He turned, but his friend was gone. Panic surged through James. He called out, but only echoes answered. Then, something stepped through the gate. A figure, emaciated, hollow-eyed, skin stretched too tight over its bones. It smiled, a grotesque, inhuman grin. You sought the truth, it rasped. Now you stay. James stumbled back. The fog thickened, hands clawing at him from the darkness. A horrible realization hit him. He had passed through all 7 gates, and there was no way back. They never found James or Daniel. But weeks later, James' recorder was discovered at the edge of the forest, playing only a single phrase, repeated over and over. I have crossed the first gate. Something watches me from the trees. Whispers of Pennhurst. The town of Spring City had long since buried its darkest chapter beneath layers of time and silence. But Pennhurst Asylum, its most infamous relic, remained a gaping wound in the town's past, a decayed monument to suffering and whispered horror. For most, Pennhurst was merely an abandoned ruin, a place for urban explorers and reckless teenagers. But for Claire Holloway, a doctoral student in psychology, it was an opportunity. She had spent years studying the history of forgotten institutions, and now, she was determined to document the stories of the lost souls who had once roamed its halls. She arrived in early April, just as the last bite of winter relinquished its grip. The asylum loomed over her, skeletal and crumbling, its broken windows like empty sockets in a skull. She gripped her recorder tightly and stepped through the rusted gates. The air inside was thick with mildew and something else, something Claire couldn't quite name. The long, winding corridors were lined with peeling paint, and old wheelchairs sat in eerie stillness. A shattered sign on the floor read Punishment Ward, in faded red letters. As Claire navigated the labyrinthine halls, she whispered observations into her recorder. The decay is astonishing. The air still carries a heaviness, a residue of the past. It feels occupied. She was careful not to let the fear settle in. Fear was irrational. Fear was what had allowed places like Pennhurst to exist in the first place, turning the mentally ill into monsters, casting them away into institutions where cruelty was the only treatment. But Pennhurst did not feel empty. Her first night, Claire set up camp in the old administrative office. She reviewed her recordings, but something was wrong. Among her notes, a whisper slithered through the silence. Why did you come back? Claire sat bolt upright, her breath catching in her throat. The voice was thin, dry, barely there, but unmistakable. She rewound the tape. Why did you come back? The voice was clearer this time, as if whoever, or whatever, had spoken knew it had been heard. Claire convinced herself it was an audio distortion, an anomaly in the recorder's settings. She adjusted the gain and pressed on. But as she continued her investigation, the whispers grew more frequent. They're watching. You shouldn't be here. He doesn't like you. Each phrase was more insistent than the last. Claire began to feel eyes on her, shadows shifting just beyond the range of her flashlight. Objects seemed to move, subtly, just enough to make her question herself. Then came the dreams. She saw a boy, no older than 10, standing in a hallway that stretched endlessly in both directions. His head was shaved, his skin pale, his eyes void of color. He did not speak, but his mouth moved as if forming words. And behind him, a shadow loomed, tall, skeletal, its fingers elongated, stretching toward the boy. Claire woke up gasping, her skin clammy. The asylum was silent, but she felt something in the air, a shift, an expectation. On the third night, she set up cameras in the punishment ward. She focused on a rusted metal chair in the center of the room, restraints still attached. Many patients had been bound here for hours, days even, left to scream into the void. She left the cameras running and returned to her makeshift camp. Hours later, unable to sleep, she reviewed the footage. At first, there was nothing. Then, at exactly 3:12 a.m. movement. The straps on the chair began to tighten, pulling against nothingness. The chair rattled, scraping the floor. And then, the whisper, closer, angrier. Get out! Claire barely had time to process the horror before a sudden crash echoed through the asylum. She grabbed her flashlight and ran toward the sound. The hallway seemed longer, the darkness heavier. When she reached the punishment ward, the chair was overturned. The straps lay in a tangled heap. And in the dust on the floor, something had been scrawled with trembling fingers. He's still here. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps. She wanted to run, but something in her refused. She had to know. She had to see. A cold breeze slithered through the hall, and she turned. The boy from her dreams stood at the end of the corridor, his small frame barely visible in the dim light. Who is he? Claire whispered, stepping closer. Who's still here? The boy's mouth moved again, silent, forming words she could not hear. And then, the shadow. It unfurled from the darkness, impossibly tall, its limbs stretching like skeletal branches. Its face was nothing but void, and yet, she felt it looking at her. Knowing her. It had been waiting. Claire stumbled backward as the walls around her pulsed. The air thickened, pressing against her skin, into her lungs. The whisper became a scream, not from the boy, but from the walls, the floor, the very foundation of Pennhurst itself. She ran. Through the winding corridors, past rusted gurneys and broken beds, she ran until the night air hit her lungs like ice. She didn't stop until she reached her car. The whispers followed. Claire never spoke of what she saw that night. She never published her research. But sometimes, late at night, when the wind howled through her windows, she swore she could still hear it. Why did you come back? Whispers at the Hotel Bethlehem. Lauren checked into the Hotel Bethlehem on a crisp autumn evening. The golden hues of the setting sun cast long shadows across Main Street, making the historic town seem almost frozen in time. She was a travel blogger specializing in haunted destinations, and this legendary hotel, steeped in history and ghostly lore, was her next subject. The receptionist, an older woman with a kind yet knowing smile, handed her the key to room 932. Let us know if you need anything, she said, her voice carrying an odd finality. Lauren nodded, dismissing the subtle unease curling in her stomach. She had researched the stories, spirits of past guests, ghostly figures in the hallways, and the eerie presence of a woman in a Victorian dress who appeared in mirrors. Nothing she hadn't handled before. Her room was elegant, yet undeniably old. The wallpaper, though pristine, seemed to whisper of a forgotten past. The antique furniture stood solemnly, as if waiting for someone long gone to return. She set down her suitcase and immediately began recording for her vlog. Hey everyone! I'm here at the legendary Hotel Bethlehem, one of the most haunted places in Pennsylvania. Tonight I'll be investigating the spirits that roam these halls. Who knows? Maybe we'll catch something paranormal. She spent the next hour setting up cameras in the corners of the room and by the bathroom mirror, where the Victorian woman had been spotted before. The thrill of the hunt filled her veins, masking any lingering fear. By midnight, Lauren was exhausted. The long drive and hours of research weighed heavily on her, but she forced herself to do an EVP, electronic voice phenomenon, session before bed. Sitting on the bed, she held her recorder and asked the usual questions. Is there anyone here with me? Can you give me a sign? What's your name? Silence. Lauren exhaled and turned off the recorder. She'd analyzed the audio in the morning. With a yawn, she climbed into bed, her body sinking into the plush mattress. As she drifted into sleep, the room's silence deepened, pressing against her ears like unseen hands. Then came the whisper, soft, indistinct. Lauren's eyes flew open. She sat up, heart pounding, scanning the room. Hello? She called. And no response. The room was still. But then, a faint giggle. It sounded like a child's laughter, echoing from the hallway. Lauren threw off the blankets and grabbed her camera, flipping it to night vision. She cracked open the door and peered outside. The hallway stretched in both directions, dimly lit by antique sconces. Nothing. She hesitated, then took a step out. That's when she saw it. At the end of the hall, near the grand staircase, stood a small girl in an old-fashioned white nightgown. Her long, Dark hair obscured most of her face, but Lauren could see just enough. A wide, eerie grin. Lauren's breath hitched. "Who are you?" she whispered. The girl tilted her head unnaturally to the side. Then she vanished. Lauren stumbled back into her room, slamming the door. Her hands trembled as she checked her camera. The hallway was empty on the playback. No girl. No sound. But she had seen her. Trying to calm herself, she climbed back into bed, rationalizing the experience. Fatigue. The power of suggestion. But sleep didn't come easy. At 3:07 a.m., something woke her. A pressure on her chest. A suffocating weight. She opened her eyes and froze. A woman loomed over her, inches from her face. Dressed in a Victorian gown, her features were sunken, her skin gray as death. Her lips parted, and a guttural, wet whisper escaped. "Leave!" Lauren's scream never left her throat. She could only stare in horror as the woman's decayed fingers brushed her cheek. Then, darkness. She woke at sunrise, drenched in sweat, the room eerily normal. But when she checked her camera, the footage told a different story. The timestamp showed 3:07 a.m. The covers on her bed ripped away on their own. The screen flickered, and for a brief moment, a shadowy figure hovered over her sleeping body. Then, a single whisper filled the audio. "Leave!" Lauren didn't need any more convincing. She grabbed her things and fled down to the lobby. The receptionist looked at her knowingly. "Did you see her?" she asked softly. Lauren swallowed hard. "You knew?" The woman smiled sadly. "The spirits here don't like being recorded." Lauren never uploaded the footage. Some hauntings aren't meant to be shared. And so, dear viewers, our journey through Pennsylvania's haunted history comes to an end, or does it? The echoes of the past still whisper through these places, waiting for the next visitor, perhaps even you. Have you ever experienced the paranormal in Pennsylvania? Share your ghostly encounters in the comments below, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more terrifying tales. Until next time, sleep tight, if you can.